Serial killers. We all know that they are somewhere out there in the world. Whether they're beside us, behind
Is it
us,
Derek?
No, it ain't Derek, man.
or we may never actually walk by one at all. One thing is certain, though. You'll never know if you pass one or not. That was the case for many years with a Edward Surratt, who lived fairly close by, I will admit. He lived in both Aliquippa as well as Cumberland for quite a few years of his early life. Born in 1941 in Aliquippa, that is, Pennsylvania, he was the son of an entrepreneur by the name of Arthur Surratt. As with almost every single serial killer that we have reviewed, there's been some sort of childhood trauma. Luckily for Edward Surratt, he did not actually forego this sort of trauma. Instead, he sort of brought it upon himself later on in life. He was a completely different individual by the time ninth grade rolled around. Previously, in 8th grade and before, he was extremely smart. Graduating with honors and being friends with many kids from school, they all attested that he was a good man, and that all began to change as soon as he got involved in crime during the 50s. This started a crime spree, so to speak, with him getting in trouble with the police many times over. At the beginning, it was only some minor charges such as disturbance of the peace, but as time went on, he was charged with even worse crimes such as battery of a police officer and such on. After this point in time, he proceeded to go in and out of the prison system and jails for petty to minor crimes and some slightly heavier charges. However, once again, his life changed when he was drafted into the Army during the 60s. Now, obviously, if you put a serial killer in the Army, things are going to get extremely interesting. And that was the case for Edward. He proceeded to beat one of his colleagues during a fight with a lead pipe and frequently abandoned his post. In 1965, he was thrown out of the Army for these infractions. Later on in life, after his father had died, he declared bankruptcy and decided to join the Marine Corps in order to escape his financial problems. In 1967, after his training was completed, he was deployed to Vietnam as part of a tank battalion. He took actions in the Tet Offensive against the Viet Cong, obviously, and finally in 1969, during one of these battles, he was wounded in the chest as well as concussed from an explosion. This ruptured one of his eardrums, and it took many months to actually receive treatment at a military hospital. From there on, he was never truly the same person, which makes some people speculate that brain damage may have been a cause of his later crimes. Overall, between his military career from 1967 to 1970, he took part in 11 military operations against North Viet Cong. But sadly, he was sent back home where he started suffering from either PTSD or some sort of mental illness, either due to his time in the military or being amplified by his time in the military. Despite his mixed experiences and actions during his lifetime, he did receive the Gallantry Cross as well as a Purple Heart, obviously for his wounds. After he finished with his military career, he was then antisocial for quite some time. Deciding to move down to North Carolina, he married a woman, and more and more signs of PTSD from his war began taking place. He once again relapsed into crime and was arrested somewhere between 1973 and 1975 in Virginia on charges of attempted rape. From here, he was convicted and he was ultimately guilty. After this, he then served about 4 years inside of a prison before he was once again let out. After getting out of prison, he went back to Aliquippa to live in 1978, where he began his rampage. Surratt had already started back in September of 1977, beating a Vietnam War veteran along with his wife to death in their home in Marshall Township, PA. Within the same area as these murders, just a few days prior, someone else was also shot with a revolver. Along with the previously mentioned victims, there were more that were starting to turn up with shotgun wounds. These include the Hydes, the Adams, as well as the Mills. Finally, in the end of his criminal career, he was suspected of 27 murders. However, the actual number may be higher or lower, as some of these bodies were never found and other crimes that he had committed he was never linked to. After he was arrested and imprisoned in 2007, he admitted to killing 6 more people. However, he was already facing multiple life sentences, therefore they did not actually bring him to court for any of these murders. There were negotiations for collecting some of the bodies that he knew of, where he hid them and whatnot. However, nothing was ever reached because the negotiations fell through. Edward Surratt never admitted or told anyone where he hid the bodies specifically. His only clue that he left slip out was the fact that they were somewhere in the woods. As a result, they continue to lay wherever Edward Surratt hid the bodies, likely in a shallow grave in the middle of nowhere, never to be found by their loved ones or anyone else. There are still plenty of things to go over, however, like why he ended up doing this and how he did it. Some of these questions can actually only be theorized on, as there's no definitive answer. Now, it's no secret that the Vietnam War was widely protested, and even after the war ended, veterans coming home were often mentally or physically abused by the hippie populations, who obviously detested the war overall and often blamed the soldiers instead of the politicians and higher-ups for any atrocities or the war in general. Sadly, many Vietnam veterans were very damaged already, and this did not help at all. This could have been what pushed Edward Surratt over the edge to do the things he did, often being alienated by the rest of society during the 70s and 80s.
The American people with the peace movement were not very friendly towards the veterans. I was very lucky to have a family to come back to and to have a job to come back to, because many veterans did not have a job or had a good family to come back to.
However, one other thing he did receive from being in the military was obviously the handling of weapons as well as his military training, which he also could have used to break into homes, tie up and restrain the victims, as well as obviously clear entire houses and kill his victims.